So, very first thing, always put your name on this because this is a handout. These are all kind of going to look the same once we get started. This is in the second block. So you want to make sure that your name's on it so that you'll be able to keep up with it and turn in your own work. Nobody else can take it. So what you'll need are your palette that we used for the optical illusion painting that had your name on it. You should have kept up with that. You'll use that. You're also going to have to choose colors of watercolor. You need a minimum of 3 colors. You're going to have to choose 2 colors that are analogous, and then from one of those 2, choose that complement. So my 2 analogous colors are going to be purple and red. Those are next to each other on the color wheel. So then I'd have to choose for one of these a color complement. What would be complementary to purple? And what would be complementary to red? All right, so I'm going to go with green. So these would be the 3 colors I use. So I have a combination of complements and analogous colors. You're also going to use black and white with this. So whenever you are putting the watercolor on your palette, I'm going to let you guys do this yourself as opposed to when we did the tempera and I put it on the palette for you. You're going to be putting the watercolor on your palette yourself. Because this is a concentrate, that should tell you that you need a very, very small amount of this watercolor to use when you're painting. So you will open up the tube and you are going to squeeze onto your palette an amount of watercolor about that big. No bigger than kind of the size of a pencil eraser. If you're using more watercolor than that, it's wasteful and you don't need to be using any more, because if you need more, you can always add, but you can't put it back in the tube. Once it's out of the tube, can't go back in. So make sure that you're not using any more than that amount of watercolor. So I'm going to go ahead and put all these on my palette. Kind of spreading them out. The other stuff that you will need will be a paintbrush, a paper towel, a water container of some kind, and then obviously just your paper. Just gonna need a teeny tiny amount of black and a little bit of white as well. All right, so we're gonna talk through a few different watercolor techniques. The first is flat wash. Flat wash is just one solid, consistent area of paint. So to use the watercolor, I'm not gonna go with my dry brush directly into this concentrate. We need to add water to the concentrate. So I'm gonna get my brush pretty wet. And then for my flat wash, let's use red. So I'm gonna mix the water with some of the red, not all of it, because I don't really think that's necessary right now. But see how it makes this thinner red? It's not caked together here, it's thinner on the palette. I'm gonna then use the brush to apply that flat wash as evenly and as neatly as I can in this sample square. So again, this is an activity just like when we painted with the tempera paint to help us practice good brush control. So we're trying to stay in these areas, make sure that it's consistent. All right, now I need to do another flat wash, but this time I want it to be concentrated, meaning that it has less water in it this time. Still needs some in order for it to go smoothly onto the paper, but we want less water. You can see here in the flat wash box, there's a really faint X. The reason for that X is so that you know that if you can still see the X, then it's not concentrated enough. You need more watercolor. I would also recommend trying not to use something like yellow in that area because yellow is just naturally very, very light. So I'm gonna get water on my brush, not quite as much as I had before, so I'm gonna kind of get off the excess. And then I'm going to do, in the concentrated flat wash, the purple. Now you can see that even though I'm still not using the full amount of the purple, this is much thicker. But it still needs to have water so that it's movable. It's so thick, almost like a paste. If you don't add water to it, you can't spread it evenly on your paper. Now, obviously, this is a different color, but if there were to be an X under that red, we would still be able to see it because it's not quite so concentrated, it's not quite as thick. So we're talking about opacity here. The more water, the more transparent. The less water, the more opaque. And you can see I'm having to go back and get more pigment on my brush more often than I did with this one because it's more difficult to spread. It's thicker. We want it to be opaque and cover up that light X inside of our box. But we're still focusing on good brush control, filling in the square, and trying our best not to go outside the lines. So I'm going to rinse my brush. And next is a gradient. What does gradient mean? Yep, dark to light or light to dark, whichever suits you. Doesn't matter. So we're going to have a concentrated amount here on this side, just like we have here. And then we're going to slowly add more and more water till it's very, very light and very transparent. So I'm going to get my brush wet again. Let's do green for this one since we haven't used green yet. It really doesn't matter. You could have done red for all three of these if you wanted to. I'm just switching my colors up for the demonstration. So I'm going to start with not very much water. Concentrated thick amount of the green paint, and I'm going to apply it to this side of my square, and then I'm going to get just a little more water on my brush. You can tell already that's applying a little bit smoother because it's got more water in it. It spreads a little bit easier. I'm going to get more water on my brush, add it to the concentrate on my palette. We can see it getting lighter. Now I'm not even going to go back to the palette. I'm just going to get water on my brush and then apply that to what's already on the palette to smooth it out and make it lighter. So you guys see how it goes from dark to lighter? I know it's wet. Maybe it's kind of hard to see. You guys see? All right. Now we're going to move on down. We're blending two analogous colors. So on my palette, which colors would that be? Red and purple, correct. So I'm going to get my brush clean, but still with a little bit of water on it. And on one side, I'm going to put one color. On the other side, I'm going to put the other. And then I'm going to have them meet and blend in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and start purple. Not for any particular reason, but I'm getting purple here. And this doesn't have to be super concentrated. It can be kind of a medium flat wash across. I'm still wanting to keep it fairly neat. And I'm going to try to kind of meet towards the middle area here. I'm going to rinse out my brush, get some of the red, and apply it on this side. Trying to keep it neat and consistent. Now, just these touching each other is not enough. They need to actually blend over each other and create a transition in the middle, kind of like when we transition with colored pencils. So I'm going to get a little bit more purple on my brush, a little bit more red, and apply this over this center area where the colors touch to make a good, nice, smooth transition. You guys see how those blend into each other? Yes, yes, okay. Now, at some point you may need to refill or like dump your water and get clean water. I'm gonna continue to use this for now, but if your colors start to look muddy on your paper, it's probably a good idea to get clean water. So I'm gonna have just a little bit of water on my brush, and now I'm blending two complementary colors, which would be what on my palette? Red and green, correct. Our Christmas here. We're after Halloween, so it's basically Christmas, right? All right, so I'm gonna start with my red on this side, just like we did when we blended the analogous colors. One color on one side going towards the middle, and then the second color on the other going towards the middle where you'll blend them on the paper. I'm gonna rinse out my brush. Green. Now, what do we know, or do we know, what happens when we mix complementary colors? Yeah, it looks gross. But sometimes it's nice because you're looking for a good neutral color, and sometimes that can be the perfect brown that you're looking for. So, yes, you're exactly right, because they have opposite qualities. It's basically because red is a primary and green is made up of what? Blue and yellow. So you're mixing all three of the primary colors together, basically, and that usually is not a good idea. Yeah. You're exactly right. If you're trying to make brown, fantastic idea. So I'm making sure I'm using some water. Now, this paper that we're using for our practice activity is not the perfect paper. It's thicker than printer paper, but not as thick as the paper we'll use for our final draft. So you have to be careful not to overlap on it too much because it will tear a hole in the paper eventually. See how those blend together in the middle? It's much more difficult to blend complementary than it is analogous. It's not a natural blend, so it kind of gets a little murky there. All right? Now, we are going to create a blend across from side to side here and here. Here, we're going to be going from a pure color and then adding white. Here, from a pure color and then adding black. So I'm going to start with the red for my white. Pure color, going all the way across pretty much. And then I'm going to begin blending white in with that color. Now, how else with watercolor could you make a color look lighter? Using water, right. So it's very rare, I would say, that we actually use white with watercolor. It's not something that you would typically do unless you just can't find the perfect tint of blue, or you can't find the perfect tint of the purple you're going for, or whatever. But typically, if you're wanting to make something lighter, we really just add water using watercolor. We don't use a whole lot of white. All right. Again, focusing on craftsmanship. I catch myself here. I'm rushing a little bit. This does not look perfect. I'm trying to get through the demo. But please have better craftsmanship than me, because that's going outside that line right there. That's a no-no. All right. Now we're going to do a pure color plus black. Let's do red again, just because I happen to have a lot of red on my palette. So kind of look and say, like, what do I have the most of? Don't keep using purple if you're running out of purple and you're not going to be able to finish. So I'm going to use red again. My pure color starting on this side. Again, trying to slow down just a little bit to keep good craftsmanship. Now I'm going to get a little red on my brush and mix it with some of the black. As we know, black is a very powerful color, and that's just as true with watercolor as it was with tempera. So it really just takes a very small amount. I honestly got way too much on my palette. That's a waste. Something that is interesting and very useful about watercolor is actually it can reactivate on your paper even after it's dry. So if I went back and I was looking at where I blended my analogous colors together and I'm like, well, I don't really think that's as successful as it could have been, you can go back and add more to it on top of it. So I'm trying to subtly show a transition here, make it as smooth as possible. All right. I'm going to go ahead and skip down to the bottom because this we are going to do 2 layers, and I want to go ahead and let the first layer dry. So I'm going to start with red. Now I'm going to start with purple. And we're just doing a flat wash. It can be a medium flat wash, it can be concentrated, but we're just doing a flat wash. And I want to just cover up the entire rectangle, trying to keep good craftsmanship. Watercolor there's a lot of variables because even just a small amount of water can change the opacity of the watercolor. So you just want to do your very best to try to keep it consistent. You don't want one really dark spot right next to one really light spot. Kind of try to even it out as much as you can. but that's also just part of the appearance of watercolor. It's not going to be perfectly flat and smooth like tempera, or acrylic. Okay, so we're just going to let that dry for now and come back to it. Next is called dry brush. It is exactly what it sounds like. When you do this one, you want to have watercolor already kind of pre-mixed, but you want to make sure that your brush is completely dry. You don't want to dip it in the water first. So you want to be able to see how these are separated out from each other like that. That's a good thing. And you're just going to barely kind of brush your brush into the paint. You don't want to see the bristles sticking back together. They should stay separate. And then you're creating texture in this box with the dry brush technique. This is just something because I want you guys to learn what dry brush is, what it looks like. When you're doing it intentionally and you want to see these textures and these brush strokes, it's a good thing. But if you're trying to paint in something solid like this down here and you see brush strokes like that, it's a bad thing. So if you're doing it on purpose and you're controlling it, cool. If you're not, then you need to add more water or more paint to your brush. All right, last three. Straight lines is exactly what it sounds like. I just want you to practice doing lines that are relatively even, that go straight across your paper and stay consistent. So I've got just a little bit of water on my brush. You don't want too much because you don't want the paint to go in places that you're not intending for it to be. Get some paint on there. And very slowly and evenly, just create straight lines in this box just to practice that even control of applying them to the paper. And again, if you start to get something like this where it's dry, then you need to add water or add paint to your brush. It should not look dry. They should look smooth and consistent. You could crisscross them, do some cross hatching if you want.